Harry Potter. Harry's a wizard and he likes to dance and sing. Not really, he's just really sad. Harry Potter. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. The boy who lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. Mr. Dursley was the director of a film called not a film. He's the director of a firm called Grunnings, which sounds like Bunnings. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and... What? Blonde? What? Blonde? And had nearly twice the unusual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning it over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never seen him. The boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with children like that. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked up his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into the high chair. Who's she gossiping with? Who knows? I guess we'll never find out. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the wall. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got in his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove round the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. He was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But, on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos, standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was! The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. A few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings car park, or Bunnings, his mind back on drills. He didn't see the owls sweeping past in broad daylight. The people down on the street did. They pointed and gazed, open-mouthed, as owl after owl sped overhead. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past then, clutching a large draught. Donut, not a drought. He's not clutching a drought. Then he caught a few words of what they were saying. "The Potters! That's right. That's what I heard." Yes, their son, Harry! Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He dashed back across the road, hurried up his office, up to his office, snapped at his secretary, not to disturb him. "Don't disturb me!" Seized his telephone. He was finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his moustache, thinking. He was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he He wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. But all the same, those people in those clothes... ... He found it a lot harder to concentrate on the drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. "Sorry," he grunted, as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realised that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile. He said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who is gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He'd been hugged by a complete stranger. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. Dudley had learnt the word "shan't." Dudley had been put to bed. He went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why these owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newsreader allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious! And now, over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Gonna be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Don't ask me why they've got weird accents. They're supposed to be English, aren't they? Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place? And a whisper about the Potters. They went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bathroom window and peered down in the front garden. The cat was still there! The Dursleys got into bed. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he'd just popped out of the ground. Nothing like this man ever been seen in Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak which swept to the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. And people were surprised he was gay. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realise that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something. But he didn't seem to realise he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He sat down on the wall next to the cat. He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses exactly the shape of the markings the cat had around its eyes. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall, who suddenly had a voice change. "Think they'd be a bit more careful. But no! Even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' dark living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent? I bet that was the deadliest Diggle." "It was Deadliest Diggle. Everybody party with Deadliest Diggle. Deadliest Diggle! Ah, Diggle, Diggle." It certainly certainly seems so, said Dumbledore. We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a sherbet lemon? A what? A sherbet lemon? They're a kind of muggle sweet I'm rather fond of. No, thank you, said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think it was the moment for sherbet lemon. But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one you know. Oh, right, Voldemort was frightened of. Hello.
Hi.
Oh.
You're okay.
It's not my hair, but it's not.